Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Schindhelm. I'm the curator of this lecture series on global culture here at the University of the Arts in Zurich. This is one of our lectures on global culture, where we usually have experts, practitioners in various fields, from performing arts to visual arts to film or architecture. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome Lars Nittve. He is today the founding director of the M+ Museum in Hong Kong. Lars has a long history with museum managing and curating. He is an art critic, writer. He is a curator, and for a long time a museum director. He worked for a long time in Sweden, where he was born and grew up. Among other positions, he was the head of the museum in Malmö. He also ran the Louisiana Museum in Hummelbæk in Denmark. In the late 90s, he was appointed as the founding director of the Tate Modern in London, where he collaborated with the architectural firm Herzog & de Meuron from Basel in the development of that museum, which was a kind of a particular new landmark for contemporary art in the Western world. Afterwards, he moved back to Sweden and became the director for the Modern Museum of Stockholm, Museum for Modern Art in Stockholm. And in the meantime, almost 5 years ago, he accepted the invitation to going to Far East and opening a new chapter on the development of contemporary art museums in Hong Kong. M+, the museum Asia doesn't have. This is the title of our lecture tonight. Before Lars will start his lecture, I just want to say that we are planning to have a conversation afterwards. In the beginning, probably among the two of us. Afterwards, we will open it up to the audience. We are looking forward to your questions and remarks. Altogether, we expect the session to run over 1.5 hours, so that we are done by 7:30 or so. Lars, thank you very much for being here. It's just flowing in last night. And we had already a full day of seminars and discussions and debates with other scholars, curators, and students today. So it's great that you're still alive and that you're still interested in doing something for us. I'm looking very much forward to it. Welcome, Lars, again. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mikael, and thank you all so much for taking time out of this Monday evening in Easter week. It's very generous of you, and I'm quite flattered and humbled by the fact that you're all sitting here now. And I know also some of you have traveled from different cities in Switzerland. So thank you so much for that. What I'll try to share with you is a little bit the story of this museum we call M+. And of course, one question might be, why do you call it M+? And I will not tell you. No, I will tell you later. It starts, I mean, as all these projects, they can have different starting points. You can say that, oh, it started with discussions in 1998 or 2005 or 2008. I mean, in reality, I think I dare say it started with a phone call exactly 5 years ago from the chief secretary of Hong Kong, which is a second-ranking minister. I didn't know that at the time, but I learned that, of Hong Kong, basically contacting me and saying this to me. I was in Stockholm then. He said, we want you to come to Hong Kong and create the museum Asia doesn't have. And of course, that's quite a statement. So this is what I said. What on earth do you mean by that? And he said, well, there are museums like, for example, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or Centre Pompidou in Paris, or, as you know, he said to me, Tate Modern in London. And they all are museums that, in a way, have a standing. They are a little bit of standard setters, at least in the field of modern and contemporary art. And most museums and people in this world, they look up to them, and they sort of use them as sort of benchmarks in a way. And if you look around in Asia, of course there are good museums in Asia, especially in Japan, which has the longest sort of history of museums. But really, if you think seriously about it, he said, there aren't really any museums that have that type of standing, which the world looks to in that same way as you look to MoMA in New York, for example. We just have to accept that. And we think that Hong Kong is the place where it's possible to create this museum, that we have a number of elements in place in Hong Kong that maybe doesn't exist in other parts of Asia, and therefore it would be possible to do it, and we've set out to do it. And he said, and flattered me, of course, heavily, that we think that you could do it. Of course, that's ambitious, was my answer. That's pretty ambitious, extremely ambitious. But of course, also quite an attractive challenge. I couldn't resist being attracted by it, and whoops, it jumped. I don't know what I do. But also quite an attractive challenge, as I said. Because of course I did remember the years before we opened Tate Modern, when we were basically a small team trying to think through what should this little baby, growing baby be? How do you define it? That period of defining ideas, of developing ideas, and then figuring out how to put together the team, the structures, the ways of doing it, so you, as an institution, deliver your vision in a way. I thought that was an amazing experience, some now 15 years back. So I did think about it, and I got sort of hooked after a couple of conversations with the chief secretary, who's also, he said, told me, the chairman of something that was called West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, which sounded very important. And I soon learned what that was. So, of course, I really asked, so what's on the table? What's there? What do we start with? What are the starting points? And, well, he said, it's basically like this. He didn't say XXX, he gave me a figure. But he said that there is a budget. And actually that budget is about $1 billion for this project. So I'm not so good at transferring now in the recent rise in it used to be a lot of Swiss francs, not so many anymore, I guess, 20% less or so. But quite a substantial sum of money. In Hong Kong dollars, it's about 7.5 billion, you can say, Hong Kong dollars, out of which 5 billion was earmarked for a building, 1.7 billion for the collection and collection-related costs, and then the rest for setting up the operation, running it and operating it before the opening of the building to sort of make it happen, to take it forward. And the second part was that it was a part of this thing he was a chairman of, the West Kowloon Cultural District. And that the West Kowloon Cultural District is a huge project in Hong Kong, in this location. And it's really thought of as a big cultural infrastructure project, where in most cases it's a matter of creating new venues for existing content. So for the Hong Kong Philharmonic Orchestra, for the Hong Kong Ballet, for the Hong Kong Dance Theatre, for the various number of theatres, as well as for the Cantonese opera, which is, of course, a central and important part of Hong Kong culture. But also there is a museum, and it's the single largest part of that entire project also. And that is not a home for already existing content, but is thought of as being created completely from scratch, from the beginning. Collection, team, everything, it will be put in place from the beginning. And the location is on this is Kowloon, so it's opposite Hong Kong Island, facing Victoria Harbour, and we'll have some more images, I think, further down the road. And it's a piece of reclaimed land, actually, as is quite a lot of land around Victoria Harbour. It was once upon a time, 170 years ago, it was twice as wide, actually, this harbour, and then it has been sort of expanded and expanded because there was a need for flat land to build on. This piece of land was actually created in connection with the construction of the Airport Express tunnel and the third of the 3 road tunnels that go under the harbour over to Hong Kong Island on the other side. And of course, it's in a way we talk about millions or billions, and of course, if you actually were calculating the cost of this land, this would be the big value, because this land in Hong Kong is the most expensive you can find anywhere in the world, and this piece of land is extremely valuable, of course, given its location. Nevertheless, culture projects are only to a certain extent about money. They're more about ideas and content and cultural value, of course. What we see here now being built is actually not up here, is not the any part of the cultural project or the cultural infrastructure, the concert halls. It's something that has to be finished before we can start building theaters and concert halls on top of it. And that is the end terminus or the station, the Hauptbahnhof for the express train systems that goes into China, that connects Hong Kong to Shenzhen, to Guangzhou, but also up to Shanghai and to Beijing. So it's a sort of an incredibly important point which will have a large number of travelers, about 200,000 per day in about 2 years' time from now. This picture is a little bit old, so they've come a little bit further than they have here now. But the M+ site is next to it, so we're not affected by that. And that is the location, and that was the part of this, that we will be part of this West Kowloon Cultural District. So we will be a part of something that mainly is a performing arts district, but there will also be shops, restaurants, and residential buildings and offices and so forth in that area. All of it owned by West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, and all the rental income from that being fed into subsidizing the cultural institutions on the site. That's a very Hong Kong model. That's exactly how we also run the MTR, the subway system in Hong Kong, which is cheap and very efficient, and it's not subsidized by the government, but they have the right to develop the real estate around the stations, and that subsidizes the operations. And this is a similar kind of model, actually, post-opening. So if I were to try to describe what we're trying to do now with this project, I think that an important starting point is to say that we're not just creating an art museum. We are quite firm on saying that we're trying to create a museum of visual culture. That means that it involves art, but also what we often call design, architecture, moving image, meaning, of course, also cinema and other types of projects. So that's one aspect, and I will soon come back to why we think this is important. And I think the other thing is that we are trying to, of course, that was the task, to create a world-class museum, but we're not trying to do it just by copying these existing models, by doing the same, or by bringing a franchise to Hong Kong or so, but actually try to create a museum that uses best practice in the rest of the world and bring that, but also see what's different in an Asian context in terms of both art and design production and on the creative side, but also on the audience side in terms of expectations, experience, and so forth. In what way do we have to be different, and in what way can we be different, but keeping the sort of good values from the best museums in the West? And this is what we're trying to do. And I try to sort of boil it down to maybe three main differences, where I think we are different from the role models in the West, whether it's in America or in Europe. And I think the key difference, or one of the two, I would say, or the three, I've expressed this in a little bit over-complex way, embracing the instability of Western concepts in an Asian context. I guess what I mean there is that these concepts we use, for example, what we call design, what we call architecture, what we call art, what we call moving image and so forth, they are Western concepts. And actually they're not as firmly rooted in an Asian creative practice as we may think. I mean, we take them for granted. And I, in a way, if you look around in Asia, and definitely if you look in Hong Kong, you will find that whoever is seen as maybe one of the most or the most interesting artists might very well be also the most interesting graphic designer or architect or commercial photographer or working in an advertising agency. And they can sort of on the same day be acting and doing things in these different contexts without any problem, without any contamination, so to say, by the fact that he or she works in the advertising industry and at the same time has an opening in a gallery the same day. While here, usually, it's very hard to be taken seriously as an artist if you work in advertising, for example, or if you have a sort of day job as something else. That's not the case really in Asia, and definitely not the case in Hong Kong. But there is a sort of fluidity between these categories. You can move back and forth very, very easily and without any problems and in the same day. And I think, as I said, this simply has to do with the fact that these concepts they were not born in Asia. They're imported there, and they were imported relatively recently. So what do I mean then? Well, if we create three boxes, and then we say that one is an art box, and another is a design and architecture box, for example, and one is a moving image box. Of course, what we aim at is really that and I think when you come to the museum, they will sort of be overlapping. I think that hopefully when you come to M+ in the future, you come not to an art museum with departments in some corners for the other things, for design or for architecture or for film down in the basement, as is the case, for example, with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is, of course, do have these departments, but they also sit in very sort of well-isolated silos, you can say, or they're very compartmentalized. I hope that in, say, 5 years' time, when you come to M+, you really think that you're going to a museum, not just an art museum, but to a museum of visual culture, where these things are in dialogue. As you can see here, they overlap. But also, of course, there will be parts of these stories that are told independently. I think it's important to be able to tell some stories about, for example, aspects of design and understand them as driven by specific developments in technology or in other things that inform decisions about design. Just like if you have a photography or a museum, an art museum that also collects photography, of course it's important to show the photography together with the art, but it's also important to acknowledge that the Leica camera or new type of printing or so, actually color printing, for example, had consequences for the development of photography. And so there are individual stories that needs to be told, but that the overall thrust rather would be about dialogue and fluidity rather than isolation and specialization. So if we look at this a little bit more, so we take these three boxes apart for a moment, and then we put something in them. In this case, three works from our objects from our collection, and then start looking at them for a while. I mean, let's look at this one, which is by the Korean artist Do Ho Soo, who was trained as an architect, but practices since 15 years or 20 years back as as an artist and exhibits in museums and Kunsthallen and art galleries and so forth. But of course, if you like, you can ask yourself, yes, is this art? Well, I guess it's art because it actually appears in an art context, and the maker sees himself and is recognized as an artist. But of course, it could be an exploration that could also take place by and be made by an architect or someone who is doing research in architecture, because it's an investigation into space and spatial qualities and transparency and so forth that relates to architecture in a way. Or in this case, is this moving image or is it an artwork? This is a classic work by Nam June Paik, Korean American, later American artist, of course often seen as the father of video art, if you like. A work from the 70s called TV Bed. Of course, it's full of TV material. Actually, it's originally it was streamed TV material that sort of came from what do you say? So the TVs were simply on. So this was whatever you saw there was the material that was being broadcast at the time. And then, but of course, arranged in a sculptural way as a part of a bed. And even from a design point of view, I've heard someone commenting on his choice of bed and so forth. But of course, is it moving image? Is it sculpture? Is it art? Of course, it's a little bit of both. It sort of floats between. I'm sorry about the lights. They are very active. and here we have another example by the Hong Kong, one of the grandfathers of Hong Kong's graphic design, a man called Kan Tai Keung, who this was a poster he made in the 90s, which won a poster competition. But of course, Kan Tai Keung is not only one of the leading graphic designers in Hong Kong. He's now in his early 70s, but still active. But also one of the leading ink artists, working in the Chinese tradition of ink art. And of course, in this case, he's fused it into a poster. So it's part of his graphic design, but of course it is also a work of ink art in itself, you can say. So you have these sort of, I mean, maybe they're a little bit simplistic examples, but we have multiple examples of this sort of fluidity between different positions, different roles. So this is something that we, instead of seeing it as a problem, instead of trying to, oh, we have to clarify this and we have to sort them out there, these artists and designers and so forth, we actually say that this is a quality. Of course, it also reflects actually tendencies in not only in Asia but out in the world, where I think you can say that a lot of the things that happen in the border areas between, say, film and video art, for example, I mean, has turned out to be very creative, or between design and art as well, or between as well as art and architecture. But I mean, it's just intensified and so obvious in a way in an Asian context. So this is something that we see as an asset, something that a flow we should go with and not go against, and try to use as a sort of basic point in how we present our collection, how we put things together, and how we present them. Another difference then, I talked about three different things, three differences, is, and I think that maybe this is the most important in a way, is that we are creating a museum that looks at the world from a Hong Kong perspective, telling another story about what's happened in the world during the last 70 years. So it's really looking at the world from a Hong Kong perspective. Tate Modern, of course, looks at the world from a London perspective. You never doubt, if you walk around in that collection, that you're in London actually, and in the UK, and in Europe, but you're also in the world. And you can say the same about Centre Pompidou. You never doubt that you're in Paris when you're there. You don't have to look out the windows. You can look at the works on the walls, and it's still very French. But of course, it's also a global perspective there. And this is normal. This is what all international museums do in a way. They of course look at the world from where they are. They anchor themselves in where they are. They collect more generously and sort of the works that are from closer by, and then much more strategically works from further afield, and look at how they make sense in relationship to the core of the collection. So in a way, this is what we do as well. Our perspective is really Hong Kong. That's where we start looking. And this is actually where we're going to build M+. There, I think, is the exact location. And over here is the so-called central of Hong Kong Island, which is the finance district with the sort of the forest of skyscrapers. But I mean, that's the starting point. Hong Kong is a city of 7.2 million people, so like your average European country, you can say, more or less, in terms of population. But of course, it's a small place in the Asian or even in the Chinese context. And it is a part of China, even though we have the system of two systems, one country, two systems, as we say. So it's run in a different way. But clearly, Hong Kong is very closely linked to the closer region in China, what is called Pearl River Delta often, which is of course being linked more and more closely to Hong Kong. There's more and more physical communication, but also travelers going across the border. Hong Kong receives about 50 million visitors from China annually now, and it's expected to go up to about 70 million in a couple of years' time. So it is really a place where a lot of people from mainland China, and especially from the region, go to as well. So we look at from Hong Kong, Pearl River Delta, but also China, Asia, and beyond. And I will, that's really a central aspect of what we're doing. And in a way, that means that in a few years' time, when you go through our museum, I guess maybe it's a simplistic way of describing it, or I know it is simplistic, but nevertheless, in a way, I think that the experience of M+ might be a little bit in relationship to other museums, with an international outlook, might be a little bit like when you read newspapers from different parts of the world the same morning. Of course, some things will be the same. I mean, now we've read a lot about the airplane accident, for example. It's been on every front page around the world, of course. And basically the story is the same. It's told in the same way. Other aspects that might be political, what's going on say in Yemen right now, might actually be on the front page as well, but actually described in slightly different ways depending on where you read the newspapers, which part of the world you are. And other stories might be the same but treated in a very different way, seen as extremely important in some parts and just as a peripheral sort of view in others. And then of course there will be plenty of stories that are unique to just one newspaper. And I think it's the same way here. Some of the stories you will see when you come to M+ will be stories you recognize from other museums, but the emphasis might be different. And of course, the works that are there are also inscribed in a different context, in a different wider body of works, which may make them look different also. Then third, what we also try to do is to create a museum that, as a physical building, maybe reflects the fact that not all things that we will be showing are, have their roots in the West simply. For example, I mean, in Hong Kong or in Asia, we in a way operate with two different concepts of art in parallel. Of course, we have the Western concept of art, which has become a global concept, which you can find anywhere in the world. There's no doubt about that. But in parallel to that, there's still a lively, strong tradition of ink art or literati art, which is, of course, very strong in Greater China, but also something that you can find versions of in all over Asia. And that's works that are, I think, where the makers or the artists, if you like, had, I think, historically a very different idea of who they were when they were doing this. What content, their self-image was clearly different from the makers in the Western concept. And also the recipients, the audience, so to say, also had a different idea of who they were, what the process they were involved in was. So it's not as similar to our tradition of art as we may think when we look at the works, which of course have many similarities. So the question for us has been a little bit, when it comes to, for example, to this type of work, are there spaces in museums that are sort of fit for this type of work? I mean, ink art, for example, still quite often is stored and sort of kept on a scroll, so on a roll. And then when you look at it, you often are a group of people, you meet around a table, and then you gradually unroll this scroll, and you sort of discover it step by step, and you comment on your discoveries, the poem maybe that unfolds and so forth. And it's a more intimate, it's a more collective experience than typically the way you look at art. But actually, if you go to Asian art museums, even if they present ink art, typically they sit like paintings on the walls behind glass. And they've sort of moved away, they've adapted the sort of white cube type museum space and sort of just put in a different tradition into that space. And we're sort of investigating and working with scholars and experts and trying to develop spaces that actually can be a better fit for these types of works, and in a wider sense maybe Asian type works, if you like, which also might involve a different type of materiality, where you have works on paper, on silk and so forth, which are more fragile and so. And we're trying to create spaces where, and this is not exactly the way it's gonna, this is an early sketch in a process, but spaces where you slow down a bit, which have a different materiality, where you actually, when you come to these spaces, you also physically walk a little bit slower, and probably the scale will be different, they will have a different atmosphere and be more friendly to the fragile materials that many of these works are made of. I can imagine that it's not only going to be ink art, it could be Noguchi sculptures as well, for example, or something like that. So these are things we're experimenting with in many different ways. I mean, we're looking at how can you present moving image material in other ways than in a cinema type format or as projections in a gallery space. I mean, what other possibilities are there? How can you open up the space between front of house and back of house, which is, most museums have this. Either you see things in the galleries or they're hidden in some basement or storage somewhere else. But is it possible to sort of make the exciting processes that take place in, for example, in the conservation studios more accessible for a wider public? Can you create a storage that, at least to some extent, is more accessible than the way we typically do it? I mean, we're not alone in trying to look at this, but it's something we're quite preoccupied with. So, what are we doing then? How are we doing this? I think a key thing and a key decision that the board of West Kowloon took when we embarked on this was that they accepted that we shouldn't really repeat the mistake that's being made again and again and again around the world, not only in Asia, not only in China, even though we often hear about that, but actually it happens all the time, is that someone decides, let's build a museum. A mayor decides, oh, we should have a new museum. And then they pick a site and they pick an architect and then they start building and then they start thinking about what should go in the museum. What we thought was absolutely critical here was that we should build it from inside out, as I say here. So you really start with a team that develops ideas and then you take it from there. And the building is, in a way, the end result. That's also a tool. That's the tool for the project. So this was something we got an agreement for. So we started with a team, and at the present we are in the actual museum team, and so this is mainly curators or people who, or registrars, a conservator, technicians, and so forth, people who work with the content, you can say, almost entirely. That's what we have on board right now. And it's, of course, a very international team. It's rooted in Hong Kong. The majority are from Hong Kong. But also we had to import expertise of different types because it just didn't exist in Hong Kong because of how the museum structure had developed up till now. So we have a quite interesting and exciting mix of a bit more than half from Hong Kong. In reality, it's these figures between other Asia and Europe are a little bit misleading because there are people with sort of double identities or double nationalities in a way, but about a quarter, you can say, are from other parts of Asia, mainland China, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, and then about a quarter or so are from other parts of the world, mainly Europe or the US. So this is a time, and they spend most the team, and they spend most of their time on working on building the collection, which we'll get to. But of course, the starting point here was really that the team, we had a small team to start with, which started to develop ideas on and try to define what this thing should be, this museum that Asia didn't have. And of course, we never said that's what we're creating. That's what politicians say. And then when we started to get a direction for it, we also then of course had to recruit a little bit more people to come on board. And then when we had a definition clear enough, which we benchmarked a lot. We had lots of roundtable discussions with different stakeholders in Hong Kong. We started working on the collection. I mean, we defined where we wanted to go with the collection. And then, but I'll get to that in a time, because we should look at what I show when I show it to my board to scare them to death. Is what the kind of staff we need when we open this museum. Museums are very staff hungry, and this is a very large museum, and very large museums have a lot of space where so you need a lot of front of house staff simply. So in 2019, I show this and say it as often as I can to mentally prepare the board for the fact that we will be a large organization, and we have to be. And there's nothing abnormal about this figure, unfortunately. But anyway, when we had developed the ideas, the key thing was, of course, to start looking and thinking about the collection. And the collection is, after all, it's the heart and soul and the backbone of the museum. That's what the museum, that gives it its identity. That is the sort of point of reference for whatever you do in the form of exhibitions and so forth. It's the thing that you can return to as a visitor and develop friendships with and so forth with individual parts of the collection. So it's absolutely fundamental in this process. And if we look at the collection, and I don't have time to dig so deep into the collection, but we were extremely, extremely fortunate to have the most amazing kickstart you can have for the collection. When I signed the contract for doing this almost 5 years ago now, of course, one of the big challenges I saw was, first of all, how do you build a collection from scratch? And how do you go about doing it? And where do you start? And how has it been done in other museums? And of course, then you find out, if you start looking at it, that almost all major museums in the world start with 1, 2, or 3 major donations. And so I started thinking about, are there any collections out there that may be looking for a solid, good home in Greater China? And of course, I got in touch with Uli Sig, and Rita is here today, And we had a meeting and we started discussing, and I basically went to Uli and Rita and I said that, well, don't forget that Hong Kong is also China. But it also has some further advantages, for example, freedom of expression, which is a good thing if you work with contemporary art. And we talked for about a year and a half, and I think that Uli's and Rita's trust in what we were doing grew over time, of course, with the team developing and so forth. And 2.5 years ago, we got a fantastic donation of 1,500 works of Chinese contemporary art, which in one go made us, put us in the position where we have the best collection anyone ever can have, actually, of Chinese contemporary art, telling the story from the mid-70s up till now, basically, about that extraordinarily rapid and amazing development in art, one of the most amazing developments in art history, I would say. So that was the starting point. That's actually how we started. And then from there, during the latest 2.5 years, we have then continued to build a collection. And we just see some examples here. We saw some examples from the SIG collection and some more down here. See what I'm using the right, Whitewash by Ai Weiwei, for example. But we have also added other works from the collection. This is a work by from the Gutai group, the important Japanese group from the 60s, 50s, 60s. This is Andreas Gursky's photograph of the HSBC building headquarters in Hong Kong. This is Anthony Gormley's Asian Field, his extraordinary large work which he did in the Guangdong province in the Pearl River Delta, together with 300 villagers in that village, which created this work consisting of 210,000 individual small figurines, which of course is an elaboration of the central issue, of course, in China, which is about the mass and the individual and the relationship between the two. And to the right here, a whole interior with everything, the furniture and everything with it, of a sushi bar by Shiro Kuramata, one of the leading designers of furniture and interior designers in the second part of the 20th century, working especially in the 60s, 70s, 80s in Japan, but also in one of the founding members of the Memphis group. So these are just some examples of things we have been collecting. And we now have a collection of about 4,100 objects or works. And I guess I had a question today during the workshops, how many works I believe we will have when we open. I think in a way it's a little bit irrelevant, because you can have a work like this, of course, which is one which takes up 2,000 square meters when we show it. And that's one work. And then you can have, of course, a number of small design objects from the sort of the peak era of Hong Kong plastic industry, and that can take up, 25 of them can take almost no space. So, but I think we will have around 8,000-9,000 works when we open, roughly, I would say. If I just extrapolate the sort of tempo we have been building the collection with to date. So that's the collection. But then also, of course, the building is important. At a certain point, we knew where we wanted to go with the building. And we had an architectural competition, the most amazing international competition, with an incredible shortlist of 6 architects, 5 of which were Pritzker Prize winners. So it was actually, if you're interested in architecture, I mean, it was really like Christmas Eve or Christmas Day every day during that jury session, because you had workshops and discussions with some of the world's greatest architects. But at the end of the day, the competition was won very clearly by Herzog de Meuron aus Basel, in a joint venture with TFP Farrells, which is the sort of local Hong Kong team that they work with, and the engineering firm Uwe Arup and Partners. And they won. This is actually the site now. We're a couple of months ago actually now. So we're actually in full force building, at least digging and building the foundations. We broke ground half a year ago. But they won with a building that looks like this. A very, very simple building. It's like an upside down T, you can say, which is a great thing in Hong Kong because it means typhoon signal number 3 in Hong Kong, which is the perfect typhoon signal in a way. It's early warning. It's not like super dangerous, but be aware. And I think that's a good signal to send out if you're a contemporary visual culture museum, that, you know, it's a little bit, you're not totally tame. You're not totally safe if you're out there. So there's a sort of a warning in it. And the building consists of a horizontal slab and a vertical slab. And this is actually projection screen, or not projection, but an LED screen. So it's like a big TV, you can say. We can screen or screen movies there, or commissioned artistic projects and so forth. And it will have be fine enough so you can be on this side of the harbor and watch it up here on the roof terrace, but also will be like a high definition television screen from Hong Kong Island side, basically. So it's more a way of signaling also that we are a moving image museum, of course. This is another more close-up angle. And it's a very simple structure, but also always chosen. It was chosen because it did a few things quite well. Maybe I go back here. First of all, it holds its own against that very messy, challenging, tough backdrop it has of skyscrapers. But it's being a smaller building, it still sort of is confident enough to hold its own there. And I think that was not unimportant. But I think maybe more important was that it also is actually not trying to be a sculpture so much in itself. It actually is ultimately a container for things that should go in it. It's a functional tool for the museum. It's a home for objects and paintings and sculptures and design items and so forth that will go into the building. So we don't have any curved walls or leaning floors or sloping ceilings or anything like that. It's 90-degree angles. It's a simple container in a certain way. And also, which was even more important perhaps, it's also a building that is very accessible, easy to get into, easy to understand how it's structured also when you're inside it. You can look down and see what's happening below you and what sort of functions are there, and you can look up and you can see what's happening up there. And you can get views out on the side, so you also understand where you are in the landscape. So I think orientation in a big museum like this, and it is a big museum, the footprint is 130 by 110 meters, and it's the size of it is like 2 Tate Moderns, for example. Or I just learned today 5 Kunstmuseum Bern. So it's a big museum, and I think it's partly driven by the fact that a lot of the things we're going to show in it are also big. Of course, Chinese contemporary art, for example, is very also space hungry, big scale quite often. This is an interesting feature that I just wanted to point out. It's called the found space. One of the intricate parts of this building was that it's actually straddles a bit over the Airport Express tunnel. And this was a big issue and big problem for most other architects. But Herzog de Meuron has this tendency to rather, instead of seeing things as problems, they see them as possibilities. And what they did here was that they rather excavated this tunnel structure, which is like this here, and then created a space that, of course, no one would ask for and no one would design just out of as a folly, but actually you ended up with a space that cuts sort of diagonally down in the basement through the space, which anchors, of course, the building in its location and where it sits, but also provides a space when we talk to artists about it or to designers about it, they get really excited because they see potentials in a space that they haven't worked in before. It's a little bit like the Turbine Hall in Tate Modern, which also most saw as a big problem, but not HDM. They didn't see it like that. And of course, it became an incredible platform for artists to work in. This is a view from what is called Artist Square. It's up towards those high rises that you saw on the first image, and it indicates the sort of hopefully natural flow you will get in here. I think it's very important that not only that it's easy to find your way around in the building, so you don't get stressed up just because you don't know where you are, but also that it feels natural and easy to get into the building, that it's a sort of a continuation of public space, if you like. These are just a couple of slides showing some of the more traditional, typical gallery spaces. There are some spaces with windows out, not so many, 3 of them to be exact, where you, of course, because light conditions can be a bit challenging for what you show there, so you want to limit that. But at the same time, it's nice to have galleries where you can have that amazing view out, for example, towards the harbor, towards the park. And as I said, we broke ground half a year ago, a little bit over half a year ago, and we complete in the end of second half of 2018, open in 2019. Finally, of course, as a consequence of the fact that if you say that the museum is just, or the building is just a tool, and you have all the other ingredients in a museum, you have a team, you have a collection, and you have an audience, of course, then of course, in a way you already exist, you just don't have the building. So we had to sort of accept that, and we started an exhibition program that we called Mobile M+. And Mobile M+ is a series of, you can say, nomadic or pop-up exhibitions, which in a way explore different possibilities of engaging the public without the presence of a building. And put it very simply, to show to the audiences in Hong Kong different types of exhibition making, what exhibitions can be, what they might expect from us, and sort of also to create, of course, to build audiences, to attract audiences, but also so little have been seen in Hong Kong, and especially has been seen without a price tag next to it. So I think that this was really, really important, and it's been very, very successful. And these are just some examples. To the right, the second project with Mobile M+ we did was in the part of Kowloon called Yamate, which to me is a little bit of the heart and soul of Hong Kong, very Chinese, very intense, where we just worked with artists who commissioned works in that neighborhood, who worked with the neighborhood and in the neighborhood, and it was a fantastic success. This is something very different. It was called Mobile M+ Inflation. It took place on the future site of the museum, and it was a huge project based only on inflatable sculptures that we had commissioned or brought from artists from around, which was hugely popular. I mean, draw hundreds of thousands of visitors as well, of course. And the next one was our first architecture exhibition based on our budding collection, and it was a much more museum-like exhibition, if you like. And again, the final one was a project, a continuation of the project we did with the Hong Kong artist Lee Kitt in the Venice Biennial 2 years ago, and then we brought a version of that, and he expanded on that in Hong Kong. So this is something that is really important. We've done 8 projects of this type. We have one ongoing now called Moving Images, which has turned out really, really well. And of course, we do lots of talks, education programs, school programs, school buses or buses that go out to the schools with and try to sort of undermine the sort of very rigid pedagogical models in the Hong Kong schools, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a very active program in order to build audiences, but also, I would say, to keep the curators sane. They also need to see the public, meet the public, do things not just in a closed box, but actually be out there also and get responses. And so we've come basically halfway through the journey to the opening, 4.5 years roughly, and we have another 4.5 years or a little bit less to go until we have full house, I hope, in the museum. So the question is, are we creating the museum that Asia doesn't have? Well, time will tell, I guess. But I think we can say this, that if we do so, then, of course, it's also the museum that the world doesn't have. Thank you very much.
I won't ask too many of them, but maybe a few before we hand it over to the audience. You started with an introduction to Hong Kong as a city and as a region, and maybe we should dwell on that quickly, because the Pearl River Delta, you mentioned 70 million mainland Chinese people coming to town every year. I could add that, for example, the Pearl River Delta being now interconnected through this railway express network comprises of a metropolitan area with around 60 million people living there more or less together in one place, which is the population of France or Great Britain. You mentioned 200,000 travelers just arriving through this terminus next to your museum in town or leaving the city, which is something like 30 or 40 million per year. So those are numbers, even for London or New York, inconceivable. You also, in the beginning, presented a few benchmarks, almost like a corporate presentation. So that's why let's dwell quickly on those numbers. For example, how many visitors do you expect in the museum?
It's actually, we haven't had a final decision on our charging policy, whether we will be free of charge and just charge for some of the special exhibitions, London model or a UK model, or whether we will have a general charge. It's a discussion that we have now with the board, and I think we would like to have free entrance and then charge for some of the exhibitions that you can communicate the content in, because we have a relatively, we don't have an audience that has a large sort of experience of going to museums. It's not built into the culture, and people generally doesn't want to pay for things they don't know what it is. Almost every country has a saying for you don't want to buy the cat in the sack or the pig in the sack and so forth, because you don't want to pay for things you don't know what it is. So I think free of charge would be probably the key to developing large and new audiences and reaching new audiences. If we are free of charge, we expect to have the predictions are a bit over 2 million visitors annually in the museum. If we have a general charge, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million. But it depends a little bit on how we structure it, and it does have, on average, you say that the difference between charging and not charging, usually you double your attendance by being free of charge.
Speaking about the benchmarks, MoMA, Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, if I'm not mistaken, the size of your museum will be almost the same like the MoMA. It's maybe slightly smaller, if I'm correct. So you have, in the meantime, more than 400,000 items purchased, and you may increase it by 8,000 or 9,000. You said. By the opening of the museum in 5 years from now. The MoMA, for example, currently owns around 150,000 items, plus more than, I think, 20 million films. Are you confident that 8,000-9,000, regardless how big they are, that 8,000-9,000 people will allow you to run a program for the size of that museum from 2019 onwards?
8,000-9,000 9,000 objects, you mean?
Yeah, 9,000.
Oh, yeah, I'm totally. I mean, we've already. I would say that already, if you start with a SIG collection, and if you make a selection out of the SIG collection where you sort of probably show half of it, you would probably you could use about 5,000 square meters immediately based on that. And of course, if you push it, it could be much more than that. I think that, of course, MoMA probably shows like 1, 2, 3%, 1 or 2% probably of their collection at the present. And I think that they suffer from having that imbalance between what they have in storage and what they can show. So probably the numbers of works that are on display in MoMA is a couple of thousand, I would imagine. I haven't counted them, but I would imagine that's the case. So I feel quite confident already now. I think that we could offer a really, really good museum, but it would be more Hong Kong, China, with some forays into Japan and Korea and so forth, but it wouldn't be that global, even though we have some amazing works from the West as well.
Being here in Switzerland, of course, probably some curiosity here in the audience about the role and importance of the SIG collection within your entire program. Can you elaborate a bit on this subject?
Well, I mean, it's a collection that would be important in any museum's program, because I think, to start with, this story, what happened in China from the mid-70s, or the end of the Cultural Revolution, and especially up till the 2010s, was an extraordinary development. And of course, the fact that Uli Sig collected this systematically since the 90s, and also went back in time and collected back in time, and with the aim, seeing that no one was really doing this systematically, and clearly not in China, that with the aim of building a museum collection is really extraordinary. And of course, any museum in the world would be extremely proud to have that collection, and it would make a huge difference to that museum. For us, of course, it's remarkable because we actually sit in China. We're part of China, and this is the place, of course, where this story should be told primarily. This is where people should come in order to learn about this extraordinary development. So, what can I say? For us, it was of course a miracle, but I think it would have been a miracle for any museum that would have been the recipient of this.
In an interview, Uli Sig, half a year ago or so, said that he wants to be remembered as the person who tried to make China a gift over $200 million, and China rejected it. You know that there was some criticism in mainland after this deal. How do you assess this criticism?
Yeah, well, not only in the mainland, also in Hong Kong, and of course that's generally politically driven. Of course, there's always this universal human sort of reaction with that someone shouldn't sort of be allowed to stand out like that and do something extraordinary. So it's always good to push down. But I think in this case it was more driven by political considerations. This was in a way manipulated from Beijing, you can say, and so it was orchestrated. And so some professors were sort of writing articles and of course being suspicious about the reasons why someone could do this. It's also very unusual in the Chinese culture to make gifts of this type and just to sort of give something away, especially in recent years, of course. And this was picked up by groups in Hong Kong who belong to the sort of pro-Beijing camp. And of course, they also wanted to question this because it's well known that many of the artists in the collection are artists who are seen by the authorities in Beijing as improper, I would say. Of course, at the heart of it, someone like Ai Weiwei, but he's not the only one.
There are certainly different ways to write the history of contemporary Chinese art. Many people say that Uli Sig collected the largest collection in the world, at least until today. That may change in the future. However, what do you think is missing, or how do you actually try now to create a kind of complementary to this kind of major pillar of your collection?
I don't really subscribe to the idea that there can be gaps in a collection, because that implies that there is a true story that can be sort of told. I think there are stories that can be told, and with the SIG collection, M plus SIG collection, as we now call it, it's of course there are many amazing stories that can be told, but there are some that can't be told because he couldn't be everywhere, he couldn't collect everything, and we've been able to, both thanks to other donations and thanks to our acquisitions, we've been able to expand certain stories, so we can tell a little bit more the story about the artistic developments in the Pearl River Delta, for example, which wasn't as well covered. And we have also added recently a large group of works from the sort of first modern art movement, you can say, in China, called the No Name Group, which was active towards the end of the Cultural Revolution and painted it secretly, where there were some key works in the donation, but we've added a substantial group of works after 2 years of research and negotiations with artists. So of course, this is what we do. So we're sort of expanding and opening up new stories also.
The SIG collection is still more or less entirely based here in Switzerland. You open your museum only in 5 years from now. So what's going to happen, how you bridge this period?
What we want to do is, of course, that we don't want the collection to sit in storage. We want it to be seen. That was also, of course, Uli Sig's and Rita's intention, that the collection was built in order to be seen and so people should get to know Chinese contemporary art. So what we do is that we participate, we lend to exhibitions, we participate in exhibitions, we also organize exhibitions that travel in Europe and elsewhere based on the collection. And then of course there will be a point when we will have to start packing it and shipping it over to Asia. Part of the reason why we keep it here is simply that, believe it or not, that it's so much cheaper to store things in Switzerland than in Hong Kong. It's actually a ratio 1 to 4 basically. So that's actually a simple main reason. It's very, very expensive to rent the same type of storage in Hong Kong. So we have to wait until we have our own storage building.
The last question from my side for now is related to what you mentioned before already, freedom of expression. You in Hong Kong enjoy it. We remember probably some years ago the conflict between, for example, Google and the mainland Chinese government over security. Google moved out of Beijing at that time to Hong Kong. It was obviously possible for Google to develop a headquarter in the country, but on the other side of the border between Hong Kong and mainland China. But on the other side, you feel, of course, that the central government or the People's Republic somehow tries to get a firmer grip on Hong Kong, as we recently saw also during the Occupy Central manifestations in autumn last year and until actually very recently. So my question is, how safe do you feel in these terms? You mentioned already more than 40 works of Ai Weiwei are part of the collection. What would happen if until 2019 you would be told that those works couldn't be put on display?
Well, I think you can't be complacent here. You can't think that it's going to be like this. You have to be on your toes, and you have to protect the situation we have, which is fantastic, of course. We're actually one of the relatively few Asian nations where you have proper freedom of expression. There are, if you talk Singapore, if you talk, many other areas, there is a fair amount of censorship, but we don't have that in Hong Kong. But I think it's something that has to be protected in a very active way all the time, and I think that our main protection is that we know that if there was an attempt to censor what we were doing, of course we would not keep quiet about that, and we know that there would be hundreds of thousands of people in the streets defending this, because that's a core value of Hong Kong, is freedom of expression, and I think the rule of law, the fact that the legal system works just as well as it does in UK. And I think these are sort of fundamental aspects of Hong Kong that the people in Hong Kong are prepared to defend and go really far in defending. So I think that's our protection in a way. I don't think there is any risk or any signals that China would like to sort of do this in a draconian way. I think that if so, it will happen. If things will happen, it will happen almost through some sort of sense of self-censorship and gradual, on a slow, slippery slope. But I think that we have to be very vigilant and fight against that. And so far, so good.
Good luck for that in the future.
Thank you.
So the floor is open to you in the audience. If you have some question, please let us know. There's also a microphone as far as I know. Anybody for asking a question? Yeah, there's somebody. Katja?
Sorry.
Lars, thank you for more explanations about M+. I've been fortunate enough to be able to observe a little bit of what's been going on during my visits to Hong Kong. I guess I'm kind of moving away a little bit from the SIG collection, which obviously has been on everybody's mind and in the media all over. I was wondering what other types of collections for architecture, design, or moving images that you would be interested in acquiring, or being, like having a generous donation from to actually cover some of the other aspects of the museum.
I mean, it's a little it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to answer saying that this is a particular area we would like to see a donation in. I think what one can say is like this, that regardless of the kind of material, whether it's art or design or architecture models or so, what it is of course there are some things that are harder to get approval for through our approval mechanism. We have to take certain things, we have to take to committees and to board and so forth, depending on its value and so forth. And of course, that kind of, it's not always those decision makers or experts in the field of art. And actually, the more expensive or valuable a work is, the higher up in the hierarchy it goes for approval, the less expertise you have among the decision makers, oddly enough. But that's how it's constructed. And that means that in many cases it's works that are, let's say we've been more challenged in acquiring works that are from the West than from Asia. We are more challenged to acquire works that are not from China or Greater China, part of a Chinese culture, contemporary culture, than further afield, because it's harder to get those decisions through. I mean, this sushi bar that I showed, for example, was quite a battle to be able to acquire, and we could partly do it just because we also were given a substantial donation as a sort of matching grant almost to what we paid ourselves. And then, of course, also our decision makers are more sort of interested in saying yes, because it's paired with a donation. So we are building the collection. Of course, we're moving from our sort of local perspective of Hong Kong, China, and then, of course, we've looked quite a lot at Japan and Korea. We're moving to Southeast Asia, and then we continuously sort of scan the rest of the world with a special focus also on Chinese diaspora. So artists who have double cultural identity, maybe, who are looking for a home away from home. So these are the areas that where we are collecting, whether they're artists, whether they are designers, whether they're architects. But then I don't think we're happy to receive donations from any of those areas, but the most challenging areas are the ones that are a little bit further away from us and where you still at the same time have high costs. Typically, of course, if we want to acquire major Western artists that make sense in relationship to the core of our collection, usually because of that market is so much more established than the Western market usually costs, so you have a double threshold because you have the fact that they're not Asian or close to China, so you have a harder argument as to why it makes sense in relationship to your collection, and the price is often high at the same time. So that's, of course, would be phenomenal if there were sort of donors streaming to us and offering donations of relevant works.
Is this an announcement?
That's an announcement, yes. You're always welcome.
Further questions?
Can I just add one question maybe? I was wondering, when you say Asia, how would you delineate Asia from the Hong Kong perspective?
That's a classic and very good question. I don't think you can really. It's Asia is an approximation, just like Europe is an approximation in reality. I mean, it can be discussed where Europe starts and ends. I mean, of course, we have European Union, but is the Bosphorus the border between the one and the other, for example? Probably not so relevant. It's an approximation. It's one of these hooks we use in order to be able to talk about certain things. For us, of course, the central perspective, I would say, where we will focus the most is Greater China, East Asia, Japan, Korea, and so forth, Southeast Asia. And we are beginning to look at South Asia, but it will never be as important as, for example, East Asia is for us. So it's about, I think, streams of influence and so between artists, between movements, between design and production and so forth also that we look at.
Okay, further questions? Katja?
Thank you. I have two questions, or one, but it has both to do with the timing. You mentioned that first of all you have the mobile M+, where 8 projects are around and you already started with it. And then the other one which goes with it is that you said that you already started to build up the audience. Taking simply the time frame in consideration that you open in 5 years from now, what is the thinking behind it? And when you say you build up the audience, what does that mean? Because like school buses is already pretty concrete.
No, I think there is no museum of this type in that area, in that region. And I think it's really about sort of preparing audiences, you can say, for this thing we call contemporary art and contemporary design and architecture, and making them used to it in a way. And so it's really about preparing audiences for what will come. And in a way you can say also it's a natural consequence of the fact that if we believe that the museum is not really necessarily linked to a building, it actually is a relationship between a content and its audiences. Of course, that means that we can actually create that meeting. We can sort of be active already now. So in that sense, it's not even preparing, it's doing, you can say. I think another thing I'd like that your question triggered is, of course, that these days it's equally important in a way as to build a building is equally important to build a digital platform and a digital presence. So we're actually doing that in parallel as well. So, and it's not as big an investment, but it's actually in terms of time and effort, and so it's a lot of work as well. And I think what you want to create there is a visitor experience that starts way before you come to the museum building actually, and that can continue way after you have left the building. So it's a extended relationship with the museum and its content also. So this is something we're working with in parallel. Thank you.
Now you said before, I presume the target group will be locals, and you said before the culture of museum in our way does not really exist. How do you see that with the museum? How do you bring people to understanding what a museum stands for?
Of course, there are museums in Hong Kong, and there has been museums for a long time, but they've, for reasons that I don't necessarily want to go into, I mean, they have not made people particularly enthusiastic about the idea of the museum. I think that museums, where shall I start in this question? I mean, museums they're very strange things, because they're these houses that house things where people come together and look at them. But they do more than that. They usually discuss and talk, and there's sort of free spaces for ideas as well. And they are also meeting places for people. So they play a lot of sort of social functions in a way as well. And Hong Kong has been of course, a very pragmatic and a very economically driven place, where also most of the people who came to Hong Kong, lived in Hong Kong before, thought of Hong Kong as a place that they came to for a period, and then in order to move on and go somewhere else. Either go back to where they came from or move on to somewhere else. Maybe if you came from China, you stopped in Hong Kong for some years, and then in order to go to America or to Canada or something like that. So it was a place of transition, at least intellectually. Of course, a lot of people actually stayed, but that's another story. And as part of that, I think that the idea of developing this type of infrastructure or places where, you know, that was about quality of life and self-understanding and so forth, there was no space for that, and there was really no interest in that as well. And I think Hong Kong has reached a point after the handover where you know, people start to think about themselves as Hong Kongers, and there's a Hong Kong identity being developed, and of course a museum is also part of that in a way. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we are creating this, and this was part of the task I was given also. It was said that we don't think about this as a tourist project. This is really a project for the people who live and work in Hong Kong, and it should be rooted in Hong Kong. The interesting consequence of that is, of course, that the reason why we travel is exactly that we want to experience things that are different from what we have at home. So we don't look for franchises, we look for something that is genuine and unique to a place. So in a way, by rooting something, if we do that successfully in Hong Kong, we create probably a very big tourist attraction as well. But that's sort of by default secondary.
Yes, I'm coming.
Thank you for coming. I'm Julia. I'm a student of the curating program here at ZHdK. Well, I wish to ask you, you've been invited to design this museum by the city of Hong Kong, maybe with an idea of building a Western style contemporary museum. So I'm curious to know how they reacted when you explained them your concept, which was mostly about designing a museum on Hong Kong history, on Hong Kong culture and Asia culture. And then I see your point, but museum and contemporary art are two theoretical concepts maybe developed by Western culture. So are you sure about the name of the museum? Museum of Contemporary Art, isn't there missing something? So I would like to learn more about M+ as the acronym of the museum. I hope it was clear. Thank you.
Yes, well, you'll see from my answer whether it was clear or not, I guess. Well, first, I mean, we don't call ourselves a museum of contemporary art. We call ourselves a museum of visual culture. So the word contemporary is not there and the word art is not there. But you're right that we are, and I think that the starting point has always been from the first conversation I had with this chief secretary. I think it's such a great title. And that we are creating a global museum, but looking at the globe, the world, from a Hong Kong perspective. So it is both local and global. Of course, an old sort of, but I'm hesitant to use that word because it's overused, but of course the word is glocal. But one can still say it, I guess. No, they were happy with when we presented our ideas, because I think that they definitely the prehistory involves Hong Kong saying no to a Guggenheim museum in Hong Kong, for example, and to Centre Pompidou in Hong Kong. They actually took a very firm decision that they wanted to create a museum that was rooted in an Hong Kong experience. Then, of course, it was pretty odd that they hired a Swedish guy to do it, who also was not known to be an expert in Chinese or Asian art. But I guess I brought some other experiences. And then, of course, for me, it was absolutely important to be humble about what I didn't know and see to that we had the right people on the team who could sort of compensate and fill in the sort of the different gaps in expertise and knowledge and understanding that we have, and we're still working on that. I'm not sure I answered your question. I answered part of it, I think, but not the whole question. What did I miss? What do you think I missed? Anyone?
Does anybody have an answer to the question which has been?
Yeah, thank you. I need a bit of that. That would be the only answer. Yeah, no, but I mean, I think we try to do something that is definitely recognizable as a museum. I mean, I personally believe in the idea of the museum. I think there is a reason why we still, if you look at it globally, have a growing audiences for museums of modern and contemporary art, for example, in a time when there's so much digital things going on and we can experience so much through other means. But still, maybe exactly because of that, people also long for that one-to-one experience in a way. So I think it will be definitely recognizable as a museum as we know it, and hopefully best practice really implemented. But hopefully it will also be a museum that is not another museum of the type you have seen many of, but actually that it has elements and aspects and definitely content that you haven't seen before. So it's about striking a balance there, I think. And the good luck is probably helpful.
I have to disclose that the two of us have to leave pretty soon because we have to leave the city in a few minutes. There is a possibility for a last quick questions and a last quick answer.
You don't get quick answers from me.
Then it's your fault if we miss the next connection. Please.
Sorry.
It's really a short question. What about a Chinese title? Maybe Chinese character?
Yeah, it's actually this has been seriously debated and discussed, and the final decision was that M+ does not need a translation. It's okay. Even in the Chinese staff and the Chinese experts say it's all right. You can have that. It's so simple. It's just like an image, so you can keep it. While actually everything else in West Kowloon Cultural District Authority is of course translated and has. And actually, of course, in all public communication, Chinese is the primary language. But M+, I think it's a little bit like MTR. Is also not translated, and it works absolutely fine. That's the subway system or the underground. But I mean, I don't have a view there. I've just trusted the expertise who have firmly said, "Don't bother about it. It's fine."
Okay, I have reserved for myself the last question, Lars. I remember when Norman Foster had completed the HSBC building, just a few weeks after the opening of the building, there was a kind of turmoil because it turned out that there was a problem with the entrance hall, and they had to rebuild the entrance hall because a Feng Shui master had found out that there's something wrong with this, with the vibes in this building. So I just want to make sure, have HDM, did they actually already consult a Feng Shui master for the M+ museum?
They haven't, but we have.
So you have?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I wish you good luck for the next 4 to 5 years still to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks so much.